In this lesson, we'll review a long nonfiction reading problem. This is part of the critical reading section. We're on page 647, question 15. And remember, there's not a progressive level of difficulty. This is a difficult problem. And I think you should be able to recognize once you start taking these questions, remember they're not in order, how to identify a difficult problem. And this is really what I call the two-part reading passage. So it's difficult. It also takes up a lot of time, and you see I've written out a lot here. So the question states, which of the following, if true, would undermine the validity of the author's assumption about the impact of mechanical clocks in lines 37 to 42? The reason I call it the two-part question is part one involves finding the author's assumption, and I've reproduced the relevant passage below. So we have to glean the assumption. But part two, once you understand it, we have to review the choices and find which of the following, if true in the answer choice, would undermine the author's point of view. This is a really common word you see in the reading. Undermine means to disprove or to discredit. And the opposite of undermine, if you see another question involving to confirm, you see the word which of the following would substantiate. Those are the two most common, although sometimes you see words like detract, which aren't very hard. Another word for undermine is the word belie. That's a verb. So two-part. So if you read this passage, it's about astronomers and pointing their telescopes at the nearest galaxy, and it talks about how different the Earth was at that time, and it really talks about time travel. And hopefully you've read that, but I'm just focusing here on this relevant passage. Remember, we want to look at the choices and see which of the following would disprove the validity of the assumption about mechanical clocks. Let's do part one, the assumption, and here it is below. When the first mechanical clocks were invented, marking off time in crisp, regular intervals, it must have surprised people to discover that time flowed outside their own mental and physiological processes. Body time flows at its own variable rate, oblivious to the most precise clocks in the laboratory. So the assumption here is that these clocks, when they were first invented, they were very crisp and regular, but it surprised people to find out that time actually flowed outside their own mental and physiological processes, and it flowed at its own variable rate, oblivious, so not following the most precise clock. So what's the assumption here? Part one, the assumption is that time flows at a variable rate. You have to do these in parts and then look at the answer so you won't be biased, but time flows at its own variable rate. We want to disprove that. Let's look at the choices here. A, people were oblivious to time on a physical level before clocks were invented. That's way off base. Remember, we're trying to disprove it. You could almost predict it. So let me just step back here. If we know that time flows at its own variable rate, to disprove that, you're looking something like an answer. Time is very mechanical. It's very uniform. And if you look at choice B, people have always perceived time as composed of discrete uniform intervals. This is totally undermining what we had listed as our assumption. And this is why I think it takes a lot of time here. You've also got to sort of follow logically the inferences, but the opposite of time flowing variably is discrete and uniform. And you can stop right there. The other choice is C, concern about time was unnecessary, way off base. Mental and physiological processes are predictable. I'm not really sure I understand that. And body time does not move at a constant rate. So E does not move at a constant rate. Remember, that kind of substantiates. We are looking for it is uniform to disprove it. So hopefully you will follow that. That's a tough question. Remember the two-part reading problem. All right, the answer here is B. See you next time. Thanks for watching.